The spirit returns in the wind. The old house sat at the edge of a forgotten forest, veiled in the shadows of towering trees and the rustling whispers of the wind. It was the kind of place where silence clung to the walls like cobwebs, and where the passage of time seemed to have been forgotten. Inside, a man lived alone. His name was Gabriel, a man who had long ago turned his back on the world, choosing the solace of isolation over the chaos of human interaction. Gabriel preferred the company of books, the crackle of the fireplace, and the soft creaking of the floorboards underfoot. The outside world had never called to him, not until she came. It began on a stormy night, as most things in such places do. The wind howled through the forest, rattling the windows of the old house. Gabriel was seated by the fire reading when he felt the first chill. It was an unnatural cold, the kind that raises the hairs on the back of your neck and tightens your chest. He ignored it at first, thinking it was simply the weather, but then he saw her. She stood at the foot of his bed, a pale figure shrouded in mist, her hair flowing like dark water down her back. Her eyes were wide, filled with sorrow and longing. She was beautiful, ethereal, a vision that made Gabriel's heart pound in his chest. He knew instinctively that she was not of this world. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Gabriel stared at her, unsure if he was dreaming, but the room was so vivid, so real. Slowly, she moved toward him, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. When she spoke, her voice was like the wind through the trees, soft and distant. "Why are you here alone?" Her question hung in the air, and Gabriel struggled to find words. He had never been good at talking to people, never knew what to say. But with her, the silence felt different. It was as though she understood him without him having to speak. "I chose this life," he finally managed. "I don't belong with people." She smiled then, a sad smile, and for the first time, Gabriel felt a stir of something he had long buried, desire. He didn't know her name, didn't know why she had come to him, but from that night on, she returned every evening. Each night, she came to him, and with every visit, their connection deepened. She was unlike anyone he had ever known, not quite human but more real than anyone he had ever encountered. Her touch was cold at first, but as the nights went on, it warmed, and the passion between them grew. Their nights together were filled with tenderness and fire, a love that transcended the boundaries of life and death. Gabriel had never felt such a profound connection with another soul, and though he knew deep down that she was not of the living, he didn't care. She had given him something he had never thought possible, love. But as with all things in life, it could not last. One night, as the moon hung low in the sky, she came to him with tears in her eyes. Gabriel, sensing that something was wrong, reached for her, but she stepped back, shaking her head. "I cannot stay," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I was never meant to be here. I was lost, wandering, and your loneliness, it called to me. But now I must go." Gabriel's heart clenched with a pain he had never known. "No," he said, his voice hoarse. "You can't leave. I need you." She reached out, her hand brushing his cheek. "I have no choice. I must return to the place where I belong. You have given me peace, Gabriel, but my time here is over." He tried to hold on to her, but her form was already beginning to fade, dissolving like mist in the morning light. Desperation clawed at him as he watched her slip away, and with her, the last of his hope. When she was gone, the house felt colder, emptier than it ever had before. Gabriel tried to return to his old life of solitude, but it was impossible. She had left a mark on him, one that he could not erase. The nights stretched on, long and lonely, filled only with the memory of her touch and the sound of her voice in the wind. Weeks passed, and Gabriel sank deeper into despair. He stopped eating, stopped caring for himself or the house. The once cozy home became a place of shadows and silence, its walls echoing with the emptiness inside him. Without her, life felt meaningless, and he found himself longing for the release of death. One evening, as the wind howled through the trees, Gabriel made his decision. He could no longer bear the weight of his loneliness. He took a length of rope and went to the garden, the place where they had once shared their most intimate moments under the moonlight. The memories flooded his mind as he tied the rope to a tree, and with a final breath, he stepped off the branch. The wind whispered through the leaves as his body swayed gently, and for a moment, everything was still. But death was not the end for Gabriel. His spirit remained tethered to the house, to the garden where their love had blossomed. He wandered the empty halls, calling out for her, but she never came. The nights were colder now, darker, as if the world itself had forgotten him. He could feel the weight of the years pressing down on him, and yet he could not leave. Gabriel's spirit became a part of the house, a ghostly presence that haunted the garden where they had once lain together under the stars. He could feel the memories of their love in every corner, every shadow, but she was gone, and he was alone. Visitors would sometimes come to the old house, drawn by the rumors of a haunting, but they never stayed long. They would speak of a man's voice carried on the wind, whispering her name, and of strange cold spots in the garden where the grass never grew. Gabriel was trapped, bound to the place where he had loved and lost. The nights stretched on endlessly, and the wind carried his sorrow through the trees. He had become a ghost, not just in death, but in life, a shadow of the man he had once been. And so, the legend of the old house at the edge of the forest grew, a place where the wind always whispered, and where the spirit of a man still wandered, searching for the love he had lost. As time passed, people forgot the man who had once lived there, but the story of his tragic love lived on. They called it The Spirit Returns in the Wind, a tale of love and loss, of a man who could not let go of the past, and of a spirit who was forever lost to the world. And on nights when the wind howled through the trees, if you listened closely, you could still hear his voice, calling out for her, lost in the wind. But she would never come. As the years passed, the house at the edge of the forest became more than just a ruin. It became a destination, a place where curious travelers and paranormal enthusiasts would visit in the hopes of experiencing something otherworldly. Most left disappointed, having felt only the usual creaks and drafts of an old, abandoned place. But there were those who claimed to hear the wind speaking, to feel the presence of something more, a sadness that clung to the very air, like a memory too painful to forget. One such visitor was Emma, a young woman with a deep fascination for the supernatural. She had heard the stories of the house and its tragic history, of the man who had loved a ghost and, in his despair, taken his own life. She was not like the others who sought thrills from ghostly encounters. Emma felt a strange kinship with the story, a loneliness that resonated deep within her. She had always been a solitary soul, preferring the quiet company of books and thoughts to the chaos of the world. When she first arrived at the house, she was struck by its eerie beauty. The forest had reclaimed much of it, with vines creeping up the stone walls and the garden overgrown with wildflowers. The wind stirred the trees, carrying with it the faintest whisper, as if the house itself was welcoming her. Emma stepped through the broken doorway, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. There was an unmistakable chill in the air, and she could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her. She made her way to the garden, the place where the love between Gabriel and the spirit had once thrived, and where his own life had come to a tragic end. As she stood beneath the tree, the one where Gabriel had ended his life, she felt a sudden rush of emotion, grief, loss, and something else, something deeper. It was as though the very air around her was alive with sorrow. For a moment, the wind stilled, and in the silence, Emma heard it. A voice, faint and distant, carried on the breeze. It called out a name, one she didn't recognize, but she knew instinctively that it was hers. Gabriel, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The wind picked up again, stronger now, swirling around her. Emma felt her heart race, but she wasn't afraid. Instead, She felt drawn to the house, to the history that lingered there, and to the spirit of the man who had loved so deeply that even death could not sever his bond with the world. The sky darkened as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the air grew colder. Emma could feel it now, his presence. She couldn't see him, but she knew he was there, watching her, waiting. "Why are you still here?" she asked softly, her voice lost in the wind. "Why haven't you moved on?" For a long moment, there was silence. Then, faintly, she heard him speak. "I cannot leave." The voice was barely more than a whisper, but it sent shivers down Emma's spine. She could feel his sadness, his longing, as though it were her own. She knew the story, but hearing his voice made it real in a way that nothing else could. He had loved and lost, and in his despair, he had become trapped. Emma knelt down beneath the tree, her hands brushing the cool earth. She closed her eyes, trying to imagine what it must have been like for him. Alone, forgotten, waiting for someone who could never return. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry for what happened to you." The wind stirred again, softer this time, almost gentle. It felt like a hand brushing her cheek, and for a moment, Emma thought she could feel him there with her. But as the darkness deepened, something shifted. The air grew heavier, colder, and the wind began to howl through the trees with a fury that sent the branches whipping against each other. Emma felt a strange pressure, as though the house itself was reacting to her presence. And then, she saw him. Gabriel's spirit appeared before her, faint and translucent, standing beneath the tree where his life had ended. His face was pale, his eyes filled with a sadness so deep it seemed to consume him. He reached out a hand to her, but she knew he could not touch her. "Why do you stay?" she asked again, her voice trembling. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, in a voice as broken as the wind, he spoke. "I wait for her." Emma's heart ached at the words. He had been waiting all this time, waiting for the spirit who had once come to him every night, who had filled his lonely life with love and then disappeared. He had never been able to move on because he had never said goodbye. "She's not coming back," Emma whispered, her throat tight. "She's gone." Gabriel's face contorted with pain, and his form flickered, as though he were struggling to hold himself together. He had known the truth, of course, but he had never accepted it. For years, he had clung to the hope that she would return to him, that they could be together again. But now, confronted with the truth, his spirit began to unravel. The wind picked up, swirling around them in a frenzy, and Emma could feel the weight of Gabriel's grief pressing down on her, as though the house itself was mourning his loss. "You need to let go," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "You need to find peace." Gabriel's spirit flickered again, his form becoming less solid, more like the wind itself. He reached out to her one last time, and though his hand passed through hers, Emma felt a strange warmth spread through her chest. And then, with a final whisper of her name, Gabriel's spirit dissolved into the wind. The air grew still once more, and the house seemed to sigh, as though a great weight had been lifted. Emma sat beneath the tree for a long time, staring at the spot where Gabriel had stood, her heart heavy with the knowledge that he had finally found peace. The house, once filled with sorrow, now felt different. The sadness was still there, but it was quieter now, more like a memory than a presence. Emma knew that the story of Gabriel and the spirit would live on, but for the first time in years, the house was truly empty. As she rose to leave, the wind stirred one last time, brushing past her like a gentle caress. Emma smiled faintly, knowing that somewhere, Gabriel was free. And as she walked away from the house, the wind whispered softly behind her, carrying with it the last echoes of a love that had defied even death.